The old men of Bir Sahara said the stranger arrived the way the desert wind arrives, without warning, without noise, and without any explanation. It was the summer of 2009. The sun was pressing down on the small village like a heavy hand, and the sand was so hot that even the lizards moved slowly. The village of Bir Sahara sat on the southwestern edge of the Algerian Sahara, a quiet, forgotten place where a few hundred people lived simple lives, grew small crops near thin streams of water, and asked very little from the rest of the world. That morning, a tall man walked into the village on foot. He was broad-shouldered and strongly built, with dark, calm eyes that seemed to take in everything at once without rushing. He wore a plain white thobe that had seen better days, and he carried a single canvas bag on his shoulder. He had sand on his boots and dust on his face, but he walked steadily, without hurry, like a man who had decided exactly where he was going and was in no rush to explain himself to anyone. His name, he told the first person who asked, was Yusuf. Just Yusuf. The village elder, Hassan al-Fassi, was a short, sharp-eyed man in his 60s who had spent a lifetime reading people the way other men read books. When Yusuf came to him and asked if there was any work available, Hassan looked at him for a long time without speaking. He noticed the man's hands, large, calloused, and steady. He noticed the way Yusuf stood, straight, but not stiff, relaxed, but not careless. It was the posture of a man who was used to being in charge of things, and who was now, for reasons of his own, choosing not to be. Hassan asked no questions. He simply nodded and said there was always work in Bir Sahara for a man willing to do it honestly. Yusuf said that was all he needed to hear. He was given a small mud-brick room at the edge of the village, near the old date palms. The room had one window, one wooden door, and a floor of packed earth. There was a simple sleeping mat, a clay water jar, and nothing else. Yusuf moved in that same evening. He set his canvas bag down in the corner, sat on the mat, looked around the empty room, and for the first time in a very long time, he breathed slowly and quietly. He slept like a man who had not truly slept in years. In the weeks that followed, Bir Sahara slowly got used to Yusuf. He woke before sunrise every morning. He worked on the irrigation channels that carried water from the underground wells to the small fields at the edge of the village. The channels were old and needed constant repair. The sand crept into them, the walls cracked in the dry heat, and the water was always trying to find a different way to go. Yusuf worked with a shovel and his bare hands, quietly and carefully, fixing what was broken and making sure the water reached where it was supposed to go. After the morning work, he helped wherever he was needed. He repaired rooftops after sandstorms. He carried heavy loads from the market trucks that stopped at the village twice a week. He helped an old man named Farouk build a new wall around his small vegetable garden, mixing the mud and straw himself and laying each brick with patience. He never complained. He never asked to be thanked. He never talked about himself. The women of the village noticed that he never received any letters. The men noticed that he never spoke about a family, a hometown, or a past. The children noticed only that he could whistle 4 different bird calls perfectly, and that he always seemed to have a small coin to produce from behind someone's ear when they least expected it. He owned very little: 2 pairs of sandals, 3 sets of simple clothes, a worn prayer mat, a small, battered radio that sat in the corner of his room and that he almost never turned on. On Fridays, he prayed at the village mosque, always in the back row, never the front. He ate simply: flatbread, dates, olive oil, and whatever the village shared with him. He never asked for more than he needed. He never took more than he was given. The people of Bir Sahara did not know what to make of him at first. He was clearly not an ordinary laboring man. The way he spoke, the way he listened, the way he thought before answering even the simplest question, all of it suggested a man with a much larger life somewhere behind him. But the desert has always been a place where men come to leave things behind, and Bir Sahara was a place that understood silence. Nobody pushed, nobody demanded answers. They simply accepted him. And in return, Yusuf gave them the best thing he had: his time, his work, and a quiet, steady kindness that slowly became one of the most familiar things in the village. What Bir Sahara did not know was this: the man they called Yusuf, the man who fixed their water channels and whistled for their children and sat quietly in the back of the mosque, was in truth Mullah Yusuf ibn Rashid al-Amari. And that name, in the world that existed beyond the sand dunes, carried an enormous weight. The al-Amari was not simply a family. It was a tribal confederation, a deep, ancient network of alliances, blood ties, and agreements that stretched across 3 countries and had existed for centuries before any modern government had drawn a single border in the sand. They controlled grazing lands, water wells, and old trade routes that no official map had ever fully recorded. In the traditional hierarchy of the desert peoples, a world that ran by its own rules, its own laws, and its own measures of power, the name al-Amari was one that made other powerful names step aside and lower their voices. And Yusuf was its leader, its alpha, its king. He had walked away from all of it on a Tuesday morning in April 2009. The full story came out years later, told most clearly by his oldest friend and former right-hand man, a sharp, loyal man named Tariq Ojda, who eventually wrote about it in a memoir published in 2017. What Tariq described was this. For years, a quiet but dangerous disagreement had been building inside the al-Amari Confederation. Yusuf had a younger brother, ambitious, impatient, and backed by outside money from business interests that wanted to take control of the Confederation's ancient water rights and turn them into a private commercial operation. These outside interests had seen the value in what the al-Amari controlled, and they had decided that the easiest way to get it was to create a division from within. They found a willing partner in the younger brother. Under the traditional tribal law of the al-Amari, a leadership challenge was permitted. It was an old rule, designed for a time when strength and fitness to lead had to be tested openly. But in the modern world, such a challenge no longer meant a simple contest of skill or wisdom. It meant that 2 sides would form. Supporters would gather behind each brother, and in the deep desert, where loyalties ran as old as blood and land, such a division meant one thing almost certainly. Young men would die. Dozens of young men. Men who had grown up in the Confederation. Men who had called Yusuf their leader since they were boys. Men whose fathers had served the al-Amari before them. Yusuf saw what was coming. He studied it the way he had always studied problems. Quietly, completely, without panic. And then he made the decision that nobody around him saw coming. He chose to give up his position. Not in anger, not in defeat. He sat with Tariq one evening, under a sky full of stars, and said very calmly, "I will not let them die for the name they gave me. The name is not worth a single one of them." He signed the necessary documents under tribal law. He transferred authority to a council of respected elders. He wrote no farewell speech. He made no announcement. He simply finished what needed to be done, stood up, shook Tariq's hand, and before the sun rose the next morning, he was gone. His brother, who had prepared carefully for a fight, suddenly found himself with a throne and no enemy. The outside business interests, who had needed a conflict to take advantage of, found there was nothing left to exploit. The Confederation, placed in the steady hands of the Elder Council, held together, peace settled over the al-Amari. Imperfect, as peace always is, but real. Yusuf knew none of this. He was already in the desert, walking. He had no phone. He wanted none. The small radio in his room in Bir Sahara stayed off, because he did not want to know. He was not hiding from punishment or running from failure. He was doing something much harder and much rarer. He was choosing, deliberately and completely, to stop being what the world had decided he was, and to find out what was left when all of that was taken away. What was left, it turned out, was a man who was very good at fixing irrigation channels. For almost 3 years, the secret held. Then came Driss. Driss was a traveling merchant, nearly 60 years old, who had spent 4 decades moving goods across North Africa in a truck that was older than most of his business partners. He had sat in the tents of tribal leaders and the offices of government ministers. He had done business in a dozen countries and had seen enough of the world to be surprised by very little of it. He pulled into Bir Sahara one cold winter evening in late 2011 with a cracked axle and a load of dried goods that needed to reach the next town before nightfall. The villagers directed him to Yusuf. Driss found the big, quiet man, crouching in the dust beside the truck, examining the axle with calm, careful hands. Driss climbed down from the cab and walked around to watch. He looked at the hands working on the metal. Then he looked at the face above them. He stopped. He was very still for a long moment. The wind moved sand across the ground between them. Somewhere nearby, a child was calling out to a friend. Then Driss said, very quietly, "Moulay Yusuf." The man in the dust looked up slowly. He did not say yes. He did not say no. He looked at Driss with the steady, patient eyes of a man looking at a door he had believed was permanently closed, now found slightly open again. "My name here," he said calmly, "is Yusuf," and he returned his attention to the axle. Driss sat down in the dust beside him, without being invited. He did not reach for his phone. He did not speak for several minutes. He watched the work being done. Then, slowly and carefully, he told Yusuf what had happened after he left. He told him about the Elder Council. He told him that the Confederation had held. He told him that the outside business interests had pulled back when there was no conflict to use. He told him that the young men, all those young men, had gone home to their families alive. He told him that his brother was alive too, and had become, in the absence of an enemy to fight, a somewhat decent administrator. Yusuf listened to all of it without interrupting. He finished the repair on the axle. He stood up, wiped his hands on a cloth, and looked out at the desert for a moment. "God," he said quietly, "is better at this than I was." He took Driss inside and fed him dinner. They talked for a while about ordinary things, the road conditions, the price of dates, the weather turning cold. Before Driss left, Yusuf asked him simply, without pressure or drama, to tell no one. Driss looked at him for a moment, then nodded. He kept the secret for 4 more years. It was a young journalist from Algiers who eventually found the thread. Her name was Nadia Ben Hassin, and she had come to the region in 2016 to write about water rights and traditional land use. A dry subject, she had been warned, but an important one. She was asking questions in Bir Sahara's small market when she heard something that made her stop. An older woman, buying flour, was giving directions to a newcomer. She pointed down the main path and said casually, "Ask Yusuf. He knows where the old channel runs. He knows everything about the water around here." The way the woman said the name, with that easy, complete trust, as though this Yusuf were simply a piece of the village, like the wells and the palms, made Nadia pause. She started asking questions. Small ones, casual ones. She listened carefully. Within days, the pieces were forming a shape she recognized. Within weeks, she had confirmed enough to write her story. When it was published, it moved quickly. The idea of a powerful tribal leader who had chosen to disappear into a desert village and spend years quietly fixing water channels and producing coins from behind children's ears. It was the kind of story that people could not stop sharing. It was too human, too unexpected, too honest to ignore. Bir Sahara was briefly visited by cameras and journalists and strangers with questions. Yusuf stood in the courtyard of his mud brick home, the same home he had moved into 7 years earlier, with nothing but a canvas bag. And he spoke to reporters with the same calm that he brought to everything. He was not embarrassed. He was not dramatic. He was simply himself. One reporter asked him directly, did he regret giving up his position? Yusuf thought about it. "I regret nothing," he said. "A man who holds a position of power holds it on behalf of the people connected to him. When I understood that holding it was going to cost those people more than losing it would, the answer was simple. It was never really about me." Another reporter asked if he missed the authority, the respect, the life he had lived before. He smiled slightly at that. "I have respect here," he said. "Hassan trusted me with his irrigation channels. That is not a small thing." A television journalist, near the end of a long interview, asked the question that everyone had really come to ask. Would he ever go back? Was there any part of him that wanted to return to that other life? Yusuf was quiet for a moment. He looked out past the courtyard wall, past the date palms, past the edge of the village, to where the Sahara opened up flat and enormous and amber-colored under the afternoon sun. "The desert taught me something," he said finally. It taught me that the most powerful thing a man can do is decide clearly what he does not need to be. He paused. I needed to learn that. It took some time, but I learned it. The cameras left. The journalists went back to their cities. The strangers with questions ran out of questions. Bir Sahara returned to itself. The date palms kept their shade in the afternoon. The water moved through the channels in the morning. The children chased each other through the narrow paths between the houses. And Yusuf went back to his work, steady, unhurried, and present in the way that only a man who has chosen his life, rather than stumbled into it, can be present. Hassan al-Fassi, the elder who had given Yusuf work on that first dusty morning back in 2009, was interviewed by one of the journalists before they left. He was asked if he had ever suspected who Yusuf really was. Hassan considered the question for a long time, the way he considered everything. He was not a man who gave fast answers. I suspected, he said slowly, that he was a man who had survived something very large. You can see that in a person, if you pay attention. The way they are careful with things, the way they listen before they speak, the way they never waste anything. He paused, and his eyes moved to the path where Yusuf was visible in the distance, walking toward the fields with a shovel on his shoulder. But in Bir Sahara, Hassan continued, we do not ask men what they have survived. We only ask if they are willing to work. A small smile crossed his face. He was always willing to work. There is a version of this story that people like to tell quickly. The powerful man who gave everything up, the secret revealed, the dramatic return to the public eye. But that version misses the most important part. The most important part is the 7 years in between. 7 years of waking before sunrise. 7 years of shovels and mud and cracked channels and heavy loads. 7 years of Friday prayers in the back row. 7 years of coins behind children's ears, and bird calls in the afternoon, and simple meals eaten without ceremony. 7 years of choosing, every single morning, to be exactly where he was. That is not a story about giving something up. That is a story about a man who looked at everything the world said he was supposed to be, powerful, important, untouchable, and quietly, without drama, decided to find out what was true underneath all of it. What he found, in a small mud brick room at the edge of the Algerian Sahara, was something that most men with far less never managed to find at all. He found out who he actually was. And he stayed.